Good morning, bon dia, buenos días.
Morning, everyone.
So let's to start after the opening words. Let's to start to the food for thought session with, now we have a session with two keynote speeches, then that will be from now to 11. The speakers, the conferences will be 20 minutes more or less, and then there will be 20 minutes more for questions, discussions, and so on. So, straightforward. Let me introduce you Enric Tello, here in my left. Enric Tello is an agricultural and environmental historian in the Department of Economic History, Institutions, Policy, and World Economy at the University of Barcelona. He leads a multidisciplinary research team that explores new societal topics from a long-term historical perspective. His research employs socio-metabolic approaches to energy and material balances of agricultural systems, as well as landscape ecology analysis of land cover and land use changes, among other topics. No? So today, Enric will talk us about feeding cities at a time of climate urgency and a global socio-ecological crisis. So thank you, Enric.
Thank you very much.
¿Vas allá? Okay.
Okay. Hello to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to give this small lecture. Let me start as a historian talking about details, if you want, on the food history of this city, Barcelona. I don't know in your cities, but in Barcelona, the first landfill that was created for food waste and the rest of municipal waste was opened in 1968. I was born in 1956. That means that throughout all my childhood, there were no landfills in Barcelona. Our kitchen garbage was collected by floods in all the buildings. And who collect this garbage? The farmers and the gardeners in the peri-urban area that came with their carts every day and collected them to compost and use them for fertilizing their gardens and their lands. So we live in a near, not totally circular bioeconomy, but a much more circular than nowadays. So let me put the idea of, and what stopped that? What happened? Why now we have to recover this circularity, and we have to make these interesting projects like EDICINET in order to reconnect our cities with farmers and farming and food. Two things is very simple, the explanation, but two things were very important for that systemic change. One was plastics. Many of these plastics that invaded our everyday life and started to be contaminating our organic waste. And this one main reason, half the reason why peri-urban farmers and gardeners stopped composting and putting this compost into their lands. The other is, at the same time, chemical fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers by industries became so cheaper. They existed before, from the First World War, as you know, but they became so cheap that, and the pressure in terms of fully industrializing agriculture from a so-called then green revolution perspective, they simply convinced them to give up this kind of circularity and just rely on synthetic fertilizers. And noticed that both things, plastics and synthetic fertilizers, came from the same natural resources, which were fossil fuels. So let's start talking about this. Why the agri-food system is so important for the current socio-ecological crisis. And many people think still in the media and in society that dealing with and solving the problem of climate urgency is all about renewables, like power plants, like photovoltaic power plants, like windmill plants, and so on and so forth. Just changing this, the rest of society can follow the same path, the same travel, with no more change. That is wrong, absolutely wrong. There is a lot of evidence, scientific evidence, that without changes in agricultural management and diets, it's impossible to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees of increase of world temperature, planet temperature. You know that we are very near to this level, 1.2, the last figure is, of increase. And even avoiding to approach 2 degrees at the end of this 21st century requires big changes in our agri-food system we live in. If you look at the figures about how much greenhouse gas emissions come from food, you will find several different, apparently different, they are not really different, figures. If you are talking about agriculture, maybe the figure is something that 12 up to 15, something like this. But then we have to add, as the IPCC does, the land use change, the advance, the extractive advance of the agro-industrial frontiers in the world. And then you have to add all the energy and all the embodied energy and embodied emissions of the whole agri-food chain until waste, until consumption, until processing, until delivering, transporting, and so on and so forth. When the agri-food system is accounted for from this systemic, not sectoral, but systemic perspective, we discover that is the first, more important part of the system that originates greenhouse gas emissions that adds up to 34% in 2015, the last figure we have in this article. You can see here that 71% of this figure is agricultural production and land use changes, and the rest, industry, packaging, transport, trade, consumption, and waste management, accounts for the rest. But notice in that figure over there, that is that part that is growing more from the 1990s until today, and that in the global north, in our cities in the global north, they represent a larger share of this global proportion. So we are facing a systemic problem that requires clearly a very deep systemic change. You know from this 2019 IPCC report on that issue, climate change and the land, that climate change affects 4 pillars of food security: availability, access, use, stability. But at the same time, this report claimed some food patterns requires more water and soil and cause much more greenhouse gas emissions, but balanced diets based on plant-based foods and foods of animal origin produced sustainably in systems that generate lower greenhouse gas emissions present greater opportunities for climate change mitigation and adaptation all over the world. Let me introduce a bit from this socio-metabolic perspective some important data that represents how our actual agri-food system at the world level is not only producing a lot of food waste, which is, according to FAO, more or less 1/3 of total food being produced is directly being wasted. But this is not the whole story. Beyond the food waste, we have the problem of food losses. That means the big quantity of nearly half, in Spain more than half, of total grains, cereals, and legumes being produced are not given to people for their nutritional needs, but to animals, right? To produce meat and dairy products. And these animals, some of them are ruminants, are capable to eat other food that we cannot digest ourselves as humans, right? And others that are monogastrics have been, over millennia of agricultural history, used to recycle our garbage, our food garbage in cities and in villages and in rural areas. But this is no longer the case, right? We are feeding these animals in industrial feedlots in order to increase the quantity of the meat and dairy products being produced industrially, and this is increasing a partial energy efficiency. We are giving them what we need to eat as humans, right? So this involves a huge amount of losses. According to this article, due to these cumulative losses, the share of global agricultural dry biomass consumed as food is just 1/4 of all harvested biomass in the world. If you account in terms of energy, 32% or 38% of the protein content. Okay? Okay, if you add to this the problem of dietary overconsumption, so consumption in excess of nutritional requirements, we can say that 48 of harvested crop are lost in between. Here you have the data. According to this data, you can see that the biggest, lowest losses, is here. But you can say, well, but this is much bigger. Yes. But this is what nature takes on our crops and our pastures. And this, for the agro-industrial perspective, means, wow, we have to attack these animals, this intake, using pesticides, biocides, and so on. From an agroecology point of view, this is an investment. This is a nature-based solution, because we need all these animals, all this herbivory, right? So the main problem is here. And if we add all the losses in the chain, the total photosynthetic biomass being produced in the world reaches our plates only in terms of weight, dry weight, 6%. That is the agro-food system we live in. Of course, diet matters a lot in changing this once we have understood how important is this overconsumption and these losses in meat and dietary production nowadays. So what's the solution to that? The United Nations Committee on Food Security together with the FAO, knows that. In former times, FAO was very pushing over decades for agro-industrial approaches, but has changed a lot. This has a lot to do with agroecology as a movement and the grassroots movements like Via Campesina and many others in the world, and also the scientific knowledge that has led these very important governance organisms at the international level to understand that we need urgently an agroecology transition to change this very unsustainable and unfair agro-food system in the world. Here you have a couple of very important documents commissioned to the high-level panel experts by this organism, by the Committee on Food Security of the United Nations, on agroecology transition and nutrition and food systems. It's a double approach, one from cities, that means end consumers, and from rural areas, that means provisioning this food consumption. And according to these new approaches by FAO and the United Nations, scaling up agroecology is key not only for addressing in a real way the climate urgency we live, but also to achieve the rest of sustainable development goals of the 2030 agenda. There is an agroecology knowledge hub in the FAO website with different documents that you can consider. And the idea is that this agroecology transition I want to talk a bit is a process that starts with eco-efficiency and input substitution, which is the level that reaches mainly the labeled organic farming nowadays. But then beyond that, we have to go towards systemic redesign and an agroecological landscape and food systems completely new at the global level. And notice that this idea by Titonel is that this moment is the more critical, the most difficult to pass through. And there are also some approaches from the European Commission, we have heard in a moment on that try to adopt the same approaches like the United Nations, although there are some lobbies that pushes in the other way. For example, this wonderful goal of achieving in 2013 20% of organic farming in Europe has been turned not compulsory, but only a recommendation. But there are some proposals that go in these directions, and it's important to take advantage of them. I have been working the last two years as member of the agroecology working group of this Standing Committee on Agricultural Research of the European Commission, writing this draft proposal that is already being launched on creating an European partnership under Horizon Europe to accelerate agroecology transition through agroecology living labs and research infrastructures. They will start in 2024, and then every year until 2033, right? Over 10 years in order to accelerate this agroecology transition in Europe. And this graph comes from this European Commission Horizon Europe proposal, but also comes, of course, from the Agroecology International Movement. You can probably recognize in the left side the 5 steps by Steve Gleasman, one of the most well-known agroecologists in the world. And then you have this interconnection of different aspects of this agroecology transition from the 10 elements and the 13 principles, or the opposite, I can't remember well, in these high-level panel experts reports or in the agroecology knowledge hub of the FAO's website. The idea is that we start with substituting carbon-intensive and based on fossil fuels inputs, external inputs, by organic and ones and renewable ones based on nature-based solutions. That's organic farming. But then we have to go to level 3, redesign the whole agroecosystems, and here comes EDICINET. Re-establishing connections between growers and eaters, developing alternative food networks. That's key. Without this connection between cities and rural areas, we cannot advance toward this transformational, not incremental, but transformational level of this agroecology transition towards the level 5, which is a completely different, systemically different agri-food system at the global level. Some people ask, well, is that possible? There are people, you know perfectly, that says, oh, that's not possible. For example, organic farming means lower yields. Lower yields requires more land per unit of food being produced. Right. If you want to do that, we will have to occupy so many lands in the world and in Europe that we will destroy natural parks, we will destroy forests, for example, and so on and so forth. Well, this, for example, a study from Sciences Po Paris is a scenario analysis of an agroecology Europe for 2015. Despite assuming a 35% of yield drop, which is a lot, probably overestimates, this study demonstrates that it's possible. An agroecology Europe can feed with healthy food 530 million Europeans, maintaining some EU exports, for example, wine and others, reducing drastically the current European food footprint, particularly these imports from soya and for grains from these agro-industrial frontiers that feeds our feedlots, improving biodiversity without requiring more land at all. Why is that possible? Just changing a bit, only a bit, our diets. It's perfectly possible without increasing 1 hectare of the current land being farmed. To do that, just moving towards a more healthy diet for us and for the planet. So, let me finish talking about, well, not only this agroecology transition is possible, is needed, is urgent, but also that it can do something that no other part of the economy can do. Some people say that maybe, but I think not. It's carbon sequestration. So, agriculture and food is not only a big part of the problem, it's also a big part and the biggest part of the solution, because agroecology can cool our earth. In addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, this agroecology transition and this soil mission that we have heard about from the European Commission in a moment can sequester a lot, can be a carbon sink. Like, for example, this 4 per 1,000 initiative is proposing all over the world. How much? Well, you know that, for example, grassroots movements like Villa Campesina and many others from agroecology movements say we are already cooling the earth. They are proud of doing that, and they know that they are doing that. Among soil scientists, I am not a soil scientist, but I have in my team, we have in our team soil scientists, there is some debate on to what extent these carbon sequestrations can really perform this very important task that this graph by Stefan Rockström and others have published. Is the idea of we are facing a crossroads. Either humanity falls into this hothouse Earth from which we will have no any option to give up, or we move again towards a stabilized Earth in the path this planet has followed from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, which makes biosphere very good for us to live with the rest of the biosphere. Can the agroecology transition do all this Earth system stewardship? This is debatable. It's not clear. But at least it's very clear from soil scientists up to now that at least we can compensate for all the emissions, which is a lot, that land use change has created so far. Can this agroecology transition go further and also compensate as a sink for the burning of the underground fossil fuels that we have burned? This is debated, but let's just think. I have put here, for example, the example of terra preta in the Amazonian, right? The discovery of this soil that was created, anthroposoils created by a previous civilization, agrarian civilization that lived there before the European conquest and the death of this and other pre-Columbian agrarian civilization opens the idea that there are limits, yes, but even if we start creating anthroposoils, maybe we can go further. In any case, let's advance towards these agroecology-based food territories, reconnecting edible cities with farmers all over the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Enric, for this inspiring talk. Now it's my pleasure introducing you to Gustavo Duch. Gustavo is an independent activist and coordinator of the journal Food Sovereignty, Biodiversity and Cultures. He collaborates closely with peasant movements such as La Vía Campesina and Plataforma Rural, and is author of several books on related topics such as Stories of Progress, Gardens of Freedom, Secrets and Lots of Little People, and Secrets and Lots of Little People is the name of one of the books, I guess, no? So previously, Gustavo worked as a director of Veterinaries Without Borders, and his talk will be The Lapses of Collapse, Exploring the Sustainability of the City as an Organizing Element of Human Society. Gustavo.
Gracias, buen día.
Thank you very much. Good
Gracias
morning.
por invitarme.
Thank you very much for having invited me. And I hope I will be up to the standard of what I've been requested. After listening to Enric, I would like to add some reflections about the challenges ahead. Allow me to raise new topics that probably are not necessarily the ones that we enjoy the most listening to, but which still are important. We need to at least raise them, right? We're speaking about cities here. When I speak about cities, or when I think about a city, I think about a beast, a monster, an evil, an immense evil that occupies 80%, or that rather waits for the 80% of the population. It's a large monster because 80% of people live in cities. A static monster which occupies 2% of the landscape, and that spends its life eating and excreting. At the end of the day, from a metabolic perspective, as Enric said, can be considered like a large beast which accounts for around 70 or 75% of energy consumption at a global level. Cities also account for 70% of CO2 emissions at the global level, and cities also account for the majority of plastic waste, which is producing a numerous amount of planetary problems. So considering cities, I mean large cities, megalopolis, are they really sustainable? Can they really be redesigned, repaired? When I think about cities, I believe it to be important to think about how cities have contributed to modifying the rural landscape. The increase or the enlargement of cities is somehow illustrative of the situation in rural environments. The fact that we all live in cities today contributes to the depopulation of the rural environments and the imposition of industrialized production models. It looks like there's no other way to fit cities than the existing one. Once villages are empty, we all have to go through industrialization, which is, of course, fossil fuels dependent and fertilizers. And as Enric said, cities account for more than 33% of CO2 emissions only for feeding purposes. And this mirror, of course, allows us to understand that we are a monocrop. As cities, we all live in a small area. We need monocrops of African palm, soya, corn, in order to feed us, or animals monocrops based on feed loads, which are invading the rural environment to feed us in cities, because it's like we are incapable of producing our own energy, of producing our own food. And as Enric mentioned before, a while ago, I mean, I'm a little bit younger than Enric, but not that much. I was born in 1965. In the 60s, well, I mean, since the 60s up to date, in the case of Barcelona and the Barcelona province, and the city, like Alvaro mentioned, was considered the world sustainable food capital. Well, since the 60s, we've lost more than 40% of agricultural plots in the province. In a few years, in a few decades, we've invaded the rural periphery, the rural urban periphery. And this is not limited, but on the contrary, in Catalonia and in many other parts of the world, the energy transition is based on renewables, on macro projects of renewable energies, which insist on destroying fertile land and putting the rural environment at the service of cities. In Spain, we speak about the empty Spain, like if it were a problem to be solved. 20% of the Spanish population live in the rural environment, so less than 20% actually, and sometimes in some contexts the population is even more extreme. But the problem is the opposite. It's the crowded Spain. Joan Barrows, the poet, a few years ago, a few centuries ago, said that the rural environment is subject to the urban domain or the urban world. It's like if the urban world sucks the rural blood, which is full of oxygen, energy, and nutrients, and gives back exhausted blood. So this reality, which is totally unsustainable from my perspective and shapes the problem we face today and the rural world, has very sharp consequences in its capacity to feed itself. As I said before, cities do not produce food. Today, Barcelona province contributes to the production of 10% only of the food required to feed Barcelona. So again, Barcelona, the city of Barcelona, lacks capacity to be independent in terms of nutrition. And this centralized agricultural models, these industrial models based on exports, is turning cities into places where food consumption becomes more and more expensive. It's becoming very difficult to have access to food. We cannot produce our own food as urban citizens. We cannot even pay for our rent. We have a housing problem in large cities, and also cities are the environments where food is more expensive. Palma de Mallorca is the most expensive city in the Balearic Islands, and secondly comes Barcelona, with Barcelona is 25%, eating in Barcelona is 25% more expensive than in other Spanish cities. And this means, well, in today's times, and in a conference like this, I believe it's important to raise this topic. Cities are concentrating poverty. Here in Barcelona, 35% of the population live under the soil of poverty. Yeah, 35% of the population live under the soil of poverty, and this means that we'll have problems in terms of accessing a healthy and sufficient nutrition. So in cities there's hunger. Last week I had a chance to visit Buenos Aires, and the situation of Buenos Aires, well, Buenos Aires is probably one of the most rapidly developing cities in Latin America, but again, in an agrarian country like Argentina, poverty is concentrating in large cities like Buenos Aires. In working class neighborhoods, which are the majority in Buenos Aires, 83% of the population experience limits in terms of accessing a sufficient quantity of food. And this is the big picture we should all bear in mind. And I believe this is one of the challenges that we shall try and respond to in the conference. Let me conclude by saying that the situation is not improving. On the contrary, in contexts where food depends on fuel and fertilizers, and in contexts where, both natural resources stem from fossil fuels, and of course, we are above our production capacity, and this means that the food inflation we are experiencing in the last few months is not going to end anytime soon. In Spain last year, the price of food has increased by 50%, and I believe it would be relevant to pay attention to other figures. In Argentina, in 1 year, the price of food has doubled. The inflation rate is 90% in Argentina in the last 12 months. We shall never forget that food production is going through a risky situation due to the crisis that we are immersed in. We are all capable of understanding that we have a food production problem and that we shall start thinking about food scarcity at given moments for many people. And this will go, of course, hand in hand with the loss of fertile lands. We've lost the microbiome that is feeding the earth. We're losing biodiversity. We are experiencing a biodiversity crisis that is having an impact on our food production models. So, in other words, it doesn't seem like the situation is about to improve. On the contrary. And also, before speaking about the measures we shall undertake to respond to this crisis, we need to take into account one last factor, which is that cities have also reshaped our way of inhabiting the world. We have undergone a cultural change in the last 40 or 50 years. Our lifestyle is not that of our grandparents and grandmothers. We've lost our circular economies. We've forgotten the important role of animals as recycling plants or as consumers of food that cannot be consumed by humans. But in cities, we can't see the stars anymore. In cities, we lack awareness about seasons. In cities, we've lost our relationship with natural paces. I don't know if you are aware of the incredible acceleration we experience in cities. Even here, in this conference, we are counting times, and we've put pressure on extraordinary speakers, and we go like, oh, quickly, quickly, we're running out of time. Perhaps we should calm down in general, but we are, penetrated by this cultural model, which is showing in a new condition called nature lack, so to speak. Have you been bitten by a wasp last summer? Have you seen a firefly recently? Boys and girls today can't see fireflies anymore. They are not bitten by wasps. We don't know how to sustain our own life anymore. We are incapable of producing food. We are showing boys and girls how to plant a potato or how to feed a chicken. No. And our urban centrism is political. The food debate we're holding here do not engage and bring on board the rural world. The food debate is taking place in cities. Our urban centrism is so bad that we are incapable of understanding that we shall let farmers lead the debate. And I believe this has to do with this urban imposition. Let me conclude by giving you a few answers. If this is the situation, or at least this is my diagnosis of the situation, well, I believe we are lacking disruptive answers. I believe we keep speaking about innovation, but I believe innovation is precisely what is producing this situation. I believe that we shall go back to systems that had proven to be useful. This is perhaps what we need. Let me give you a couple of examples about the needs we shall debate. It is true that in cities we lack the necessary skills to lead profound changes. But the question I would ask myself is, the initiatives that we are financing here in municipalities, are they anti-capitalist initiatives? Because the problem we are raising has to do with capitalism, with understanding food as a commodity. And all our projects, or at least the ones I've heard of here in Barcelona, are capitalist. We are not questioning capitalism. And there are very close examples. Here in Barcelona, in Europe, not everything can be, teachers, professors, doctors, they are being paid by the state. And they don't have to defend their work. They don't have to compete. The health sector, the educational sector are not capitalist, are public, they are public. We don't have to pay our own education or our own health. It's a public system. Whereas farmers, they have to fight in the market. Food production systems are capitalist, 100% capitalist today, with very clear consequences. I would like to raise the topic of anti-capitalist problems. The second disruptive challenge that I would like to raise is the following. My apologies if I'm attempting against the name of the conference or other projects to which I am part on edible cities, smart cities. Why not de-urbanizing? Why not shortening cities? Why not promoting active policies to empty cities, to mild down cities, to humanize cities or animalize cities, which probably would be more relevant. I have a dear friend who is a shepherd, and he says, if you found a school, you'll grow a village. Perhaps we shall fund here in cities rural schools so that people go back to nature and reconnect with natural bases and feel a part and not owners of nature, so that they can find the basic services in rural environments, where to live, and thus changing the world. Thank you.
Gracias, Gustavo.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, for this disruptive and precise diagnosis to contribute to our debate.
To ask questions, to debate, to discuss. If you want to ask to the...
Check. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Teresa de Bruyne, coming from Belgium, and very inspiring talks. I talk a lot to farmers, and we think that farmers are connected to nature, but I see actually they're very much driven by the pharma industry, telling them how to produce crop and how to yield. And I think if you want to speed up the transition we all have to do, we have to reconnect them to nature again. And I think that's an important thing to do. So if you're talking about living labs, is that the way you're going to approach those living labs in giving them the knowledge to do it themselves?
Organic farmers used to say they work with nature, not against it. And as I explained, organic farming is the start of this scaling up best practices, organic practices, towards agroecology, transition towards what? Towards agroecology-based food territories, right? In which a word that hasn't not yet been mentioned, but is very important, food sovereignty could become possible again, right? Both, as Gustavo said, for farmers and rural areas and for citizens and cities, right? So yes, of course, what agroecology wants is to liberate farmers from this let's say, rule or this dependence on external inputs and food chains and market food chains that are controlled by big corporations right now. And they received a small amount of the value added they generate and is paid at the end of the agri-food chain by final consumers, because the largest share in terms of money also is taken in by these big corporations nowadays.
No more questions?
Some more questions? Over there. Este hombre.
Hello for both speakers. I'm Emil Wibben, Wageningen University. In the Netherlands today we have local regional elections. Exactly the point of the corporates steering farmers, and the farmers claiming that you should be proud on a farmer. Well, they actually earn hardly anything. They are now voting against changing to agroecology. This is democracy, and actually the expectation is that by the coming weeks, nationally, there's nothing possible to change to agroecology because the voting in favor of farmers who are used by the corporates. And that is the main view, that actually the environmental people are against farmers, and this is possibly the democratic outcome. How to convince, how to change towards these ideals.
Me cuesta mucho hablar en nombre de los agricultores y de las agricultoras. Yo creo que ellos ya tienen sus voces de expresión y
and they can speak in first person, so whatever I say here does not have so much value. Here in Spain, what happens is the same thing that happens in Holland. As you were saying, we're facing the reality of a field which is very much in favor of being kept within these models of industrial farming, and they protect themselves, and they have a very reactionary perspective against small changes that are proposed to be introduced. And the situation, in my opinion, is very much related to this imposition to which Professor Tello was referring in the last 30, 40 years of an industrial agriculture which has condemned many families of farmers which are outside the map. They're already on the margins. And therefore, we're speaking about the 1%, 2% of the population that has managed to be kept as farmers, population producing food. It's just 1% of the active population. And this 1% is basically industrial agriculture, and it's difficult for these people after the experiences they have gone through. It's difficult for them to be leaders of a change, a model change towards food sovereignty. Food sovereignty and this defense of the new agriculture is not being defended by the fields. Officially, it's not. The trade unions are not defending this either, but it's being defended by the marginal agriculture, transitional agriculture, people who are practicing agroecology, and women who are introducing changes in the way we understand these farming practices. And therefore, they should not take on even more responsibilities, but cities should adopt these responsibilities. We from the cities should vote for active policies in favor of making these transitions possible. And the policies, which means political commitments and political positioning in order to make it easier, to make it possible for these agricultures to earn importance and also to make their lives easier. Nowadays, they're like swimming against the current, and we should be able to modify all these policies. Some timid advances have been made as for these policies, and they had been mentioned by the representative of the European Union, but I think they should be even faster and more powerful if we want to be on time and reverse the current situation. But let me repeat, I think that we should question them directly.
Hi, thanks a lot for this opportunity. So it's basically related to this discussion that is happening now. So it's basically, in my perception, the agricultural, agroecologic production, it could be a bit more expensive, no, than the industrial production. So how can we scale up the agroecological production in the economic system that we have now? That makes it very, very difficult. I have another question, but we can later. The other question is a bit the food waste. So I think a lot of the waste that makes how much waste we are having in the food is the regulations we have in our laws. So for example, I understand that in the European Union it's forbidden to feed livestock with waste. It's actually forbidden. So this practice that used to happen before is by law forbidden. So then there are all of these obstacles to go back to a more circular economy in the agricultural system. So how can we change that?
Yes, both things, in my perspective, are examples of all the contradictions that I pointed out with that graph by Titonel. We are in the most difficult path of the transition, right? And this involves a lot of contradictions, including the problem of this misunderstanding that Gustavo was also referring, and you have pointed out, between rural and people and citizens. We have to address them in a systemic way again. We have had in the Standing Committee on Agricultural Research on Agroecology of the European Commission some debates, very important debates, I think, on what is meant by a true agroecology living lab, and who deserves to be paid by these funds, by the European funds, in terms of boosting this agroecology transition. And it's very clear that for us, that from the people, the advisors of these new calls, let's see the result, but that we have to select the best practices and the people that are farmers, women, men, that are actually doing the best practices everywhere. And they exist usually under a precariousness situation, usually working against the tide, right? And sometimes, and from some people in the academia and in politics, sometimes they look at them as being very small, too precarious, without understanding that they are the seeds of the future. And we have to strengthen them, to support them, and, very important, to start integrating them, because a part of their precariousness and their difficulty has to do, and this includes the price of organic food. And the contradiction is a contradiction, right? That nowadays, people that can access to healthy food used to be upper middle classes that can afford for them. And this creates a niche in the market. We do not want to be a niche in the market. We want to change the whole chain, right? But these are the contradictions in this situation that must be solved with this transition and this scaling up. It's not the opposite. It's not scaling what we have today, right? It's not that. This is a scaling out, if you want, but not a scaling up. The scaling up is integrating this, and this will have to solve all the systemic change. And local food change, closing the relationship, which is a metabolic, a biophysical relationship in new food territories, agroecology-based, is the solution. And this is also a cultural, a social, a political closing of relationship among people that have to recognize each other. I understand your point. This is happening, as Gustavo said, also in Spain. But we have to talk with them and we have to convince them. And the way to convince them is by practice, by showing the good that exists everywhere. There are seeds of change. Let's look at them and convert them into lighthouses, right? For the rest. This is the way of this transition.
Sí, al respecto también quería añadir algunas
I
cosas.
wanted to add a couple of comments. Agroecological food is not more expensive than conventional agriculture. It's more expensive within a capitalist deregulated model. I think that's important. It is obvious, and I come from Argentina, and they say obvious all the time. It's obvious that it's cheaper from the metabolic or physical point of view to produce local organic food than food dependent from petrol derivatives. Therefore, my proposal is the following. This scale-up should be related to understanding that agroecology is a proposal of popular feeding. It is not a proposal of feeding the elites, but it goes hand in hand with anti-capitalism, understanding food systems within the framework of a fair society which can feed the whole of the population. And therefore, I think that we can scale it up precisely by focusing on those who are the most vulnerable ones. If we really based our decisions on political grounds, and this is what we are missing. Look, in Catalonia, every day in Catalonia, 1 million menus are served of public feeding among schools, colleges, prisons, yes, universities, 1 million menus that due to a political decision, supposedly within a democratic framework, could be 100% agroecological. Why haven't we reached not even 1% of public feeding with agroecological foods that also within a public chain regulated by the state, we could prove that they are cheaper than conventional foods. Children are fed in the public schools of Barcelona, and the cost is €6 per day, contemplating not only the price of what they eat, but what you need from transportation, waiters, and cooks. €6. We are bringing agroecological food to children. Don't tell me that this is more expensive, because it's not true. It is more expensive within the present agroecological model. Enric Tello was referring also to our youth. Barcelona has a network of 55 municipal markets. Municipal markets had been an anti-capitalist space where producers, directly and under the protection of the municipality, had their own spaces in order to sell their products directly to the population. And all the farmers who were nourishing the population arrived from the outskirts of Barcelona. Within the tours that you are going to participate in, I urge you to take a look at some of the markets of Barcelona, capital of sustainable foods. Take a look at the snapshot. How many farmers are still the owners of this public space? Municipal markets I'm referring to. Maybe you encounter some surprises.
I don't know, is there the last question, maybe? Okay.
Yes, thank you. David Steinwender from Austria. In Austria, we have a lot of small farmers compared to other European countries. And when we talk about kind of decommodification and anti-capitalist, I would say, food networks, and you consider people having loans and debts in order to have invested already a lot. So, how would you approach people who are not really kind of feeling comfortable within the agro-technical food system and can be reached with, I would say, agroecological approaches, but still they have a lot of already invested because of false consulting? How can you make these alliances? Because it somehow sounds contradictory. If we say we want to have a decommodified food system, and on the other hand, people are kind of relying on or are captured within this, I would say, capitalist system, and are not willing, or they don't want to get out because of these dependencies. How we can get rid of these dependencies?
How can we liberate or rid up farmers from this market dependence? For example, the independent endeudament. Yes, is another side of the question. I would say on that decommodification doesn't mean necessarily not to have markets. There are different types of markets, right? What we need are more local, more direct, as Gustavo said, more, and of course farmers have now the problem that we are asking them to do perhaps many things at the same time. We have to, as Gustavo said, we have to talk with them and to understand what is their real situation. It's true that in past times they produced, they recycled our garbage, and they have these direct points of selling in municipal markets in Barcelona. I know them. I knew them. I used to go there to buy. in one of these. I don't know if it is still there or not. Maybe some still are there. But in any case, I think changing the markets is part of the issue, right? And again, don't make the blame on them, on people. Change the system and liberate people from. I think it's because many people suffer this system and cannot see a way out of them. But and also from the cities, of course, and from the citizens. So let's break this alienation of two sides, right? And start this relationship, which is an new economic way of a relationship, but also a cultural, a social conversation. And I know some people I am looking at in this room know many good experiences, right, small, yes, but wonderful experiences that this is already working. So let's start with this and give strength to them, empower them in order to demonstrate that yes, it is possible. It is possible to do this. But it involves a very deep systemic change.
Sin entrar en el detalle que...
Without going into the details of your question, and I fully coincide with Enric's answer, we should think whether the problem is a financial problem when the European Union is distributing so many million euros for so many plans. And if we say the problem is a supposedly lack of financing, I don't think we're on the right path or the right framework. I would say rather the opposite. Let's see how can we not function based on so much dependency from this type of economic funds. Also because we often forget where the weakest point of the food chain are for farmers. I don't know in Austria, but in Catalonia we have a problem with the amount of land. We have a capitalist land market, therefore to access land, to access a plot, means that you are going to be indebted for life because you are paying for this land at the price of micro renewables. We can search for inspiration in other countries where land is regulated by public systems. I think it's more interesting to go back to the other approach, the approach of regulation and intervention, than continue to trust the injection of money coming from these big entities. My friend, the farmer, I asked him the same question. What would you do if you were responsible for the money coming from the European Union to get out of the current economic crisis? And his answer was, maybe that's the problem. Money is the problem.
Okay, so it's time now to close the session. Thank you very much to Enric and to Gustavo for your conferences, very inspiring, and also for the debate, and to all the audience for your questions and this very alive debate that could last for 2 more hours, and we can continue in the coffee break. Thank you very much to all.